Another set of important topics has to do with employment issues that face federal contractors. And what we're talking about today really is a slew of issues that really impact all employers, but in particular, federal contractors need to be even more wary of some of these issues. And these issues I'm talking about are issues that are thanks to COVID-19. How do we manage our workforce in the wake of a lot of conflicting orders, in some cases, a sort of a patchwork quilt of federal and state directives and orders, standards from different government agencies that apply to the workforce we have in the office or in the plant, as well as the people that are working remotely. So, and what's maybe even more challenging for managers is that those requirements really have changed the way we manage employees in some cases, at least as it applies to COVID-19. So some of the things that we've all learned about over the years about what you can do and can't do, or where you're limited and where you're not limited, some of those rules have changed completely and they're upside down in the wake of COVID-19. So as Marco Gonzalez was talking about earlier with regard to export controls, how we could spend an entire week talking about just that topic, I think the same is true for employment issues. So I wanted to really just distill some of the most important things you ought to keep in mind as you continue to manage your workforce through the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as figuring out how to have your workforce return. And we've all seen, again, there's a lot of disparity in terms of who's going to come back to the office and when, in what cities, and and what are the limitations. So now's the time to be thinking about that return to work plan for sure, but you got to know some of these issues as you do it to keep your employees safe. So the name of the game, or the names of the game, if you will, are safety and flexibility in my mind. Safety has to be front and center in terms of how you're going to manage your in-person workforce, but you also have to worry about safety when you have remote employees, making sure that they're staying safe, that they're operating and functioning in a safe environment within their homes as well, not only on the cybersecurity side, but also on the physical side. What I've told lots of clients since this arose is that flexibility should also be front and center for us to maybe reconsider some of the norms, some of the rules that we work by in terms of what we consider to be a productive employee. Just because we've been used to having employees collaborating in the office doesn't mean that they can't collaborate remotely, and that they shouldn't be allowed to work in a remote setting to be able to let the company function through the pandemic. So flexibility, again, front and center. You have to be aware of whatever your state executive orders are, because as I mentioned earlier, they are disparate. What's true in Michigan is not true in Pennsylvania. Certainly is not true in New Jersey, although there's some coordination among a few states like New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Pennsylvania are very similar in terms of how they've attacked things, and they've set certain standards that they're trying to abide by, but they're not exactly the same in terms of the travel restrictions and the work restrictions. Who can open and in what density, for example, varies very much from one state to the next. So you got to be fully aware of what the executive orders say and what they don't say. OSHA and the CDC guidelines, really those go hand in hand, because OSHA is expecting that employers will employ CDC guidelines in terms of physical separation or social separation and hygiene practices, the wearing of masks, the cleaning of your workplace, and keeping people as separate as possible. And those requirements are going to vary depending on what size employer you are as well. If you're a 10 or 11 person employer, the restrictions are going to be far less than they are for a much larger employee, but some of the same rules will still apply, like keeping people as separate as possible, employing hygiene practices, and keeping the office as clean as possible. Managing remote workers is a bigger challenge because there's so many of them, and our systems, I think, are at their limits in some cases. But what we're going to talk about in a little bit is making sure that you've got policies and procedures in place so that you can manage those employees more effectively. And these are, in addition to mitigating risk in terms of the hygiene practices, you need to be aware of complaints and how to handle whistleblower claims. I would not treat any complaints or whistleblower claims that you get as not serious. Each of them should be treated as a serious matter, and we're going to talk about an anti-retaliation policy in a second. But I think that this is an area in which you're going to see some substantial litigation potentially. Employees that raise their hand report a problem or are concerned about safety in the workplace and they get either demoted or terminated or transferred or something of that nature, this is going to be a fertile ground for potential litigation. And there's actually, I can't cite to every state in the union, but I know in New Jersey that there's already been a case filed for a whistleblower claim in this context. So employers need to be pretty aware of it and take it seriously. Some of the new rules of the road for sick callouts, and this comes, by the way, from the EEOC's guidance about implementing the ADA in the wake of COVID-19. So for sick callouts, if you got an employee who calls out sick and is not going to come to work, the employer can ask about a COVID-19 diagnosis and symptoms to be sure that if and when they come back, that they that they're handled appropriately. If the symptoms even resemble COVID-19, that person should be treated as a possible case and handled as if that person had a positive diagnosis until they can prove otherwise. Temperature checks is something that an employer could not have done before COVID-19. Now, temperature checks, even though they are technically a medical exam, because of COVID-19 and the desire to protect employees and prevent the spread, an employer can take temperatures of both guests and employees at the office. Keep in mind, though, that not all COVID-19 cases show a positive or show a fever, so they don't necessarily have a fever in all cases. Now, that's in terms of testing versus antibody testing, especially where somebody has exhibited symptoms. You can require testing for active virus to make sure that you're not going to bring positive cases into the office, but you can't test for antibodies. That's clear. So there's a distinction there. And what we're talking about is, again, allowing a limited medical exam for purposes of preventing spread, but asking an employee to go get an antibody test, putting aside whether it's effective or not, is not permissible under the guidelines. And then lastly, doctor's notes. You can ask for a doctor's note to confirm that somebody's not contagious and that they're eligible to return to work. But keep in mind the timing of the testing and the note availability. Sometimes employees are not going to have access to a timely test before they come back. So you may have to wait an extended period of time before you can get the test and actually get the note from the doctor because of limited resources. So protecting employees and keeping a safe workplace, as I said before, safety first. An anti-retaliation plan against whistleblowers is critical. Having a clear policy that the company is not going to tolerate retaliation in any form is really critical. It should be in your employee handbook and it should be in your code of compliance, but for sure it needs to be front and center in terms of how you manage these claims on a going forward basis. Any policies that you implement for remote working, for example, need to be non-discriminatory. So they need to apply to everybody who's eligible. You can't pick and choose based on improper categories. And I think when you start to distinguish among employees in terms of who can work from home or who can have a flexible schedule versus those that can't, you need to be really sure that you've justified why you've made a distinction, because there may be questions later. Again, this is a potential fertile ground for claims and potential litigation. So you need to be careful about that. Again, CDC guidance is very important, understanding the density rules and how to keep people safe. Each whistleblower claim needs to be investigated. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to call out the troops and retain counsel in every single case, but you need to treat them seriously. You need to, speak to the whistleblower if they can be identified. Understand what the concern is and address it and document what you did so that you can show that you took it seriously, because that's really what's required under these whistleblower laws, and to prove that you weren't retaliating improperly against somebody if you decide to address it in some other fashion in the employment context. Providing PPE and supplies is important depending on your workplace. What I would tell you is minimizing outside visitors is really helpful right now. We have a lot of technology, including what we're using today. Really, it's going to do you good to minimize outside visitors where you can. Not prohibit them necessarily, but minimize them. And then self-screening and documentation of larger employers I've seen are starting to do this, where they're providing tools and even some remote tools in terms of how to catalog self-screenings, temperature checks in the morning before people come to work. Also helpful just to be able to document people's conditions and then you're also going to do a better job of keeping sick people out of the workplace as a result. So with remote employees, this is a tough one for some employers that are not used to having a remote workforce, but I think we've been all thrust into this realm. Some people kicking and screaming, I suppose. Determining who can work from home, who can have a different work arrangement, flexible work arrangement, needs to be as equitable as it can. So I think you need to throw out, again, the old norms about how you made these determinations. Be flexible and open-minded, and apply the rules across the board. I would tell you that there are, for folks that work in an office environment on a computer or at a desk all day, it's quite often difficult to tell people that they can't work from home because you expect them to live up to some productivity rules that may be a little bit unrealistic in the current environment. There are certainly jobs that you can't do remotely, certainly in the production and distribution areas, for example, but keeping an open mind and being flexible about who can work from home and they have office and professional positions, I think is where you should start from at the moment. But in any event, however you make that determination, document it and ensure that it's going to be done equitably and that you don't trip up and base some of those decisions on improper classifications. You should let folks know that it could be changed or discontinued at any time. When your state executive orders allow you to return to work, you can cancel the remote work environment or the remote work arrangements. I would tell you that even after you start to bring your people back full time, it's a little bit smart to be as flexible as you can even going forward, because you're going to experience employees whose kids are home, who can't go to school, who can't go to daycare, and people are going to potentially get positive tests here and there or be exposed to those who are positive. So again, just keeping an open mind and giving people the flexibility they need to be safe and productive is going to be important. Lastly, I've talked to a number of folks who have performance problems with people who are in remote situations, and they want to discontinue their remote work environments solely because there's a performance concern. Either the people aren't working productively or they're not working enough. Maybe they're distracted by outside things. What I've told folks is that rather than just willy-nilly cancel the remote work arrangements, what you need to do is manage the performance problem on its own. So, canceling that person's remote eligibility, or the entire company's for that matter, just because of a couple of performance problems doesn't make sense in most cases. Deal with the performance issues, manage it like you would as if the person were in the office, and then proceed from there. So a couple of issues about remote employees. The Fair Labor Standards Act requires that the employer has to pay for telework that's performed even if it's against policy. What that means is if somebody's working overtime and if they're non-exempt, they are still eligible for overtime even if it's against company policy. We've heard lots of stories about people that work earlier and later than they did when they were in the office. If they're entitled to overtime, they got to get it. Now, that doesn't mean you can't advise people of a policy against it, and that doesn't mean that you have to tolerate it infinitely. But if it's performed and you have a good faith basis to know that it was done, you need to pay for it. All right, so you can have a policy in place against it, and you can enforce it. But once the work is done, and if you're aware of it, you need to pay for it. Remind people about their meal and rest breaks. Believe it or not, people are. Most people or many people are working more often and not taking their usual breaks. They're still entitled to those breaks throughout the day. You can require time reporting as a policy for all employees. Again, it needs to be a policy that applies to everyone. There's lots of different systems out there to do that. Even informally, you can implement a system that works for your company, but certainly that's something you can implement. And the childcare and homeschooling issues are a difficult batch of problems because, as we know, there are a lot of school and daycare closures. Parents are working remotely with young kids that need attention throughout the day. I think it's difficult to manage in many cases, and it's difficult to impose a rule that applies to everyone. Flexibility here is really important. You can still require your employees to productively put in the number of hours that they're required to do. But I would urge you to be as flexible as you can. For example, if somebody can work, 5 hours during the day while their kids are in school, but they need to put in their 3 hours to make their 8-hour day after the kids go to bed. So long as that's not so disruptive for your business and it doesn't overly burden the employer, something you ought to consider. I think your employees will appreciate it, but it's certainly going to prevent some of the performance issues and morale problems that we're seeing in the workforce. So as I keep using the word flexibility, I think it's really important in this instance to be as flexible as you can and to give people the flexibility they need to manage their lives within reason, of course. Now, certainly if you've got the time to update your policies as we go, you should do it. But I think once the pandemic starts to ease a bit, it's a time to update your policies and review them in light of what we're experiencing now. Who can work remotely? What kind of requirements are you going to impose on people's work sites? Can people work in a remote office, a WeWork type of a space versus working within their home? If you allow them to work from home, what kind of gear and equipment are you going to provide them? But having a policy written down so that people can pull the policy out if we have to go back into remote situations, I think will be really helpful in terms of how you respond. What's your policy on home office expenses? Does it apply to furniture? Does it apply to supplies, computers, et cetera? Having a consistent policy is really important here. Again, you want policies so that you can implement them and apply them uniformly across your entire workforce. And then lastly, anti-harassment and any other similar policies apply not only to the workplace, but also to remote work arrangements. So especially, we talked about anti-retaliation. That ought to be a policy and a practice that each of us has in our companies. It's even more important when it comes to a remote workforce, insofar as they're going to have more difficulty reporting in some cases. Anti-harassment, harassment can happen whether you're working in the office or whether you're working remotely. Thanks to technology, it's not so difficult to harass a coworker, by text message or by email or by some other means on social media. I think it's important that you make sure you train your people and ensure that they're following the policies, whether they're in the office or not. We talked a lot about confidentiality, cybersecurity with Mark Snyderman's program. I just wanted to emphasize it here that our IT resources in many cases are overburdened. Many companies aren't used to facilitating so many people that are working remotely at a given time. I think you just got to be sure that people are using the right kinds of systems. They've got the right protections in terms of securing their networks at home so that you don't have gaps in your system that are going to allow scammers and phishers and others to take advantage of your employees. Training, I think, is really helpful too, to prevent people from responding to phishing emails and other things that are going to come across their desks. Sometimes people get comfortable working on a couch or sitting in bed or anywhere in their home, and they forget about the requirements that they would normally apply in the office. Electronically monitoring your employees is an interesting topic that I think is probably a little bit large for today, but I would tell you that it's an important topic to think about. Many people are thinking about watching what their employees do because they're worried about productivity. It goes way beyond making sure that people are productive, and as people work from home, you start to wonder about whether there's an invasion of privacy issue. So I would tell you that if you're considering this, it packs a bunch of legal issues all together in one topic. So it's something that you ought to discuss with your counsel before you decide you're going to start to monitor your employees. Form I-9 compliance, I just want to mention to you that there are some relaxed requirements in terms of having or how people have to execute I-9s for new employees. So there is a remote signature policy that's in place with USCIS. So check the website before you do it. But long story short is you can get people to execute I-9s remotely with a follow-up with original signatures. And this is still developing. I know this was a bit of an emergency rule that was applied. So it may change as we go forward as the pandemic drags on. but you can do it remotely in the first instance. Union avoidance activities, you know, now with people in such a disrupted state, I think it's even more important now to think about union avoidance if you're in a non-union environment. You know, what you do today in terms of how you manage your workforce through this pandemic is going to potentially pay dividends or be detrimental if you don't do the right thing in terms of your susceptibility to union organizing activities. You know, treating your employees with the flexibility that I keep talking about, helping them through the pandemic and being understanding and providing them with the tools and resources they need is going to go a long way to making people, you know, avoid unions or not be so interested in union organizing if that happens in your workplace. So again, training people, listening, addressing items as they come up, and, you know, thanking people for the hard work they're doing in a difficult environment is going to go a long way toward union avoidance.